Clara Hayes had lived on the outskirts of the New Mexico territory for nearly 3 years since her husband's passing, and the isolation suited her. The sun-baked plains stretched endlessly around her small ranch, the only signs of life being the grazing horses and the occasional tumbleweed rolling lazily past her porch. Locals in the nearby town knew little of her, and she preferred it that way. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her dark hair pulled tightly back, her eyes a wary blue that seldom gave anything away. Yet beneath that calm exterior lurked a secret she had vowed never to speak of, a night she could neither forget nor fully understand. That night had come unbidden in the midst of a violent desert storm. Rain had pounded the clay rooftops of the ranch house, and the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls across the barren landscape. Clara had been alone. Her husband had been taken too early by a fever, leaving her unprotected and weary of the world. The storm had driven her to the small wooden door at the back of the house, seeking the faintest hint of safety. When she saw him, an Apache warrior drenched and strikingly silent, standing at the edge of her property as though the storm itself had carried him there, fear had gripped her at first. She remembered clutching the doorframe, her knuckles white and the pounding of her heart in her ears. This stranger, tall, broad-shouldered, with skin the color of rich earth and eyes as dark and fathomless as the desert night, should have been a threat. Yet there was something uncommonly calm in the way he approached, his movements deliberate, respectful. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he simply watched her, the rain dripping from his long, dark hair, the muscles in his arms taut but not menacing. Clara felt a pulse of something she couldn't name, fear mingled with fascination, a dangerous cocktail that made her chest tighten. By the time he finally spoke, his voice was a soft rumble over the wind, more a vibration than words. He asked no questions, made no demands. He simply indicated with a tilt of his head that he sought refuge from the storm. And despite every warning etched into her mind by years of surviving in a harsh, unforgiving world, Clara found herself opening the door. What happened inside that small, dimly lit house was a blur of warmth and shivering, of whispered words and fleeting touches that neither could fully define. It was a night outside the boundaries of reason, a collision of two worlds that were never meant to intersect. She had felt a connection so profound it was almost frightening, a pull that neither time nor circumstance could erase. The memory was both intimate and inexplicably raw, leaving marks on her soul that she wore invisibly, hidden from the eyes of a judgmental world. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the desert washed and gleaming in the early morning light. The Apache warrior was gone, as silently as he had arrived, leaving Clara alone with the echo of his presence. She had locked the memory deep inside herself, buried beneath layers of prudence and fear. She told no one, not her neighbors, not the town's gossiping women, not even herself fully, for the weight of what she had experienced felt too dangerous to name. It was a secret she carried like a wound, an ache beneath her ribs that sometimes throbbed with longing, sometimes with regret, but always with the undeniable truth of a night that could not be undone. Now, as Clara moved among her horses and tended the small fields surrounding her ranch, she kept that night firmly in the shadows of her mind. The world saw a composed widow, one who had survived loss and hardship with grace, yet beneath her careful exterior, the memory of the stranger, the warrior who had entered her life like a storm and vanished like the desert wind, remained vivid. It was a part of her she had never revealed, a taste of passion and fear that belonged to no one but her. And she intended it to remain that way, for no one in the towns of New Mexico could understand, and no one could ever know, until perhaps the wind carried his shadow back to her doorstep. The wind had shifted across the high desert that morning, stirring the tall grasses and carrying the scent of sage and dust. Clara Hayes had learned to read the subtle language of the plains, the rustle of the bushes, the distant cry of a hawk, the way shadows fell across the ridgelines. It was how she knew something had changed, though at first she couldn't say what. Perhaps it was simply her imagination, shaped by the endless loneliness of the past 3 years. Yet when she caught sight of a dark figure moving along the horizon, her heart skipped a beat. At first she thought it might be a traveler, a lone cowboy or a trader passing through. But there was something in the way he moved, graceful, deliberate, with the surety of someone who belonged to the land in a way she did not. As he drew closer, rain slicked and tall against the rising sun, her breath caught. It was him, She would have known those dark, penetrating eyes anywhere. The set of his shoulders, the careful, unhurried strength in his stride. Taco, the Apache warrior who had stormed into her life on that violent night she had buried in memory. Her first instinct was fear. Years of living alone had taught her that the desert could be unforgiving, and men, especially mysterious strangers, could be dangerous. She stepped back into the shadows of her doorway, her pulse quickening. Yet beneath that fear was something else, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since that night. A shiver of recognition, of longing, prickled her skin. Memories she had tried to lock away surged forward. Vivid and undeniable, the storm, the warmth of his presence, the electric tension that had left her trembling in ways she still did not fully understand. Taco did not call out. He did not approach recklessly. Instead, he paused at the edge of the clearing, scanning the ranch with sharp, assessing eyes. He had changed in some ways, perhaps age, perhaps the weight of experience, but the essence of him remained the same. The warrior she had once known was still there, silent and powerful, and she felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. She wondered fleetingly why he had returned. Was it fate? Coincidence? Or something more dangerous? Days passed with Taco lingering near the outskirts of her land. He helped with the work quietly, checking fences, guiding the horses back to shelter during sudden dust storms, his presence both comforting and alarming. Clara tried to maintain her distance, speaking only when necessary, her voice careful and measured. Yet every time she caught him watching her, those dark eyes steady and unblinking, she felt a pulse of recognition that made her pulse quicken. It was as though the desert itself had conspired to reunite them, stirring up all the emotions she had fought to bury. Their first conversation was terse, yet charged with unspoken meaning. He spoke of the land, of the weather, of the cattle, but never of that night. She said nothing about it either, keeping her secret tightly wound, yet every glance and every small gesture spoke volumes. The air between them was heavy with memory, a tension that was at once intimate and dangerous. Clara knew she had to guard herself, to protect both her heart and her reputation, and yet she could not deny the thrill of seeing him again. The way his presence made the world sharper, more alive, more dangerous. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mesas, painting the sky with streaks of crimson and gold, Clara found herself alone with Taco near the corral. The quiet of the desert was complete, broken only by the soft snorts of horses. She felt an ache in her chest she could not name. He looked at her then, and for the first time the barrier between them seemed to tremble. It was a look that promised nothing but threatened everything, stirring the memories of a night that had never truly ended in either of their hearts. Clara realized, with a mixture of fear and longing, that her secret was no longer entirely hers to guard. Taco's return had reopened a door she had thought permanently closed. And though she did not yet understand why he had come back, she knew one thing with terrifying clarity. The quiet life she had built for herself was about to be irreversibly changed. The desert sun rose over Clara Hayes's ranch, burning gold across the horizon, but it could not melt the unease that had settled in her chest. Rumors had reached the town of a gang of outlaws moving through the territory, cutting off supply lines, robbing homesteads, and leaving devastation in their wake. Clara had heard of their exploits before, of men disappearing into the canyons, of families left destitute, of ranches burned to the ground. She had always thought she could avoid them, living far enough out in the wilderness, but fate, it seemed, was not content to leave her in peace. Taco had noticed the tension immediately. His dark eyes, sharp as obsidian, scanned the distant ridges as he rode along the perimeter of the property. His silence was more eloquent than any words, and Clara felt the weight of his presence pressing against the careful wall she had built around her heart. One evening, as the wind whipped dust across the corral, he approached her. His horse, a sleek black stallion, shifted under him with impatient energy, mirroring the urgency in Taco's gaze. "They will come," he said, his voice low and certain, as if stating a fact that could not be ignored, "and you cannot face them alone." Clara's first reaction was defiance. She had survived the desert storms and loneliness. She had survived loss. She did not need a man, even one as commanding as Taco, to guard her. But his eyes held a quiet authority that made her hesitate. They were not just eyes of a stranger or a hired protector. They were eyes that had once seen her in ways no one else had, and in them was an understanding that unsettled her. "What do you want in return?" she asked, suspicion threading through her voice. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he shifted his weight, resting a hand lightly on the reins, his gaze never leaving hers. There was an unspoken memory between them, a lingering connection to that stormy night she had locked away in silence. She saw it in his stance, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way he measured her reactions as though he had done so before. "I will protect your ranch," he said finally, his words deliberate. "But you will owe me something. Not now, not yet. But there is a price, and you know it." Clara's heart stuttered. The price was unstated, yet she understood exactly what he meant. It was a price she had never imagined paying again, one she had buried deep beneath grief, dignity, and caution. The thought of opening that door again both terrified and exhilarated her. And yet, with outlaws closing in, with the threat of fire and ruin looming, she knew she had no choice. Reluctantly, she nodded. "Then we have an agreement. But make no mistake, I am not afraid to fight for my home." Taco's lips quirked into a faint, knowing smile, and for the first time in days, Clara felt a spark of hope mingle with the fear in her chest. Over the next several days, Taco worked quietly but efficiently. He reinforced the fences, checked traps along the perimeter, and trained the few ranch hands she had to be alert and strategic. Yet even as he prepared her property for battle, the tension between them grew. Every brush of his hand against hers, every close encounter as they moved through the corral, was a reminder of the night she had never revealed, a memory she had thought safe in her solitude. The outlaw's approach came silently, like shadows stretching over the mesa. Clara, standing beside Taco, felt the adrenaline surge through her veins. It was not just the threat of danger that set her pulse racing. It was the knowledge that she was standing beside the one man who had once touched her soul in ways no other could. And now, by necessity, they would face life and death together. As the first signs of the outlaws appeared on the ridge, Clara realized that her quiet, solitary life was gone forever. The desert had demanded a dangerous alliance, and Taco, the warrior she had never truly forgotten, was at the center of it. Together they would face what came, but the storm had only just begun. The days following Taco's arrival passed in a strange rhythm. Work on the ranch became a shared ritual. The routines of feeding the horses, checking fences, and tending the small vegetable garden binding them together. Yet beneath the surface of practicality, an undercurrent of tension thrummed between Clara and Taco, impossible to ignore. Every brush of his arm, every accidental closeness as they maneuvered around a stubborn stallion, sent tremors through her chest. She had thought she had buried the memory of that night long ago, but Taco's presence unearthed it with ruthless clarity. It began subtly. A look in his eyes that lingered too long, the curve of his mouth as he smiled at her when she least expected it, the way he moved through the ranch with quiet confidence that reminded her, inexplicably, of the stormy night he had entered her life. Each moment forced her to remember the warmth of his hands, the intensity of his gaze, the way he had made her feel both safe and vulnerable at once. She caught herself staring, heart hammering, cheeks flushed, and chastised herself for the weakness. She was a widow, a woman alone in a world that demanded caution. Desire, especially for a man like Taco, was dangerous. Taco, for his part, seemed equally affected, though he wore it with his usual stoicism. He would occasionally pause near her, watching her with a steady gaze that hinted at thoughts unspoken. There were moments when his eyes softened, flickering with something almost like longing, though he never voiced it. Clara felt it in her bones. The memory of their first encounter was not hers alone. He remembered it too, and the thought made her pulse quicken in ways both thrilling and terrifying. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the mesas, Clara was repairing a broken section of fence near the corral. Taco approached quietly, carrying a coil of rope over his shoulder. "You work too hard," he said, his voice low, almost a growl cutting through the dry wind. "I'm managing," Clara replied without looking at him, forcing her hands to steady the fence post. "It's my ranch. I know what I'm doing." He knelt beside her, helping to secure the post with skillful hands. Their fingers brushed briefly, lightly, almost casually, but the spark of electricity that shot through her was unmistakable. Clara drew in a quick breath, her heart pounding. She wanted to pull away, to remind herself of the danger and feeling. Yet the memory of that stormy night surged forward, unbidden, Every sense seemed to recall the touch she had never spoken of, the closeness she had never admitted, the intensity that had haunted her alone-filled nights. "You've changed," Taco said quietly, his voice softer now, almost intimate, but not in ways that mattered to me. Clara's hands stilled. She looked at him, searching his face for hidden meaning, for a trace of the night she had feared might never leave her. The memory of the rain, the warmth, the closeness, they were all alive again, tangling with her reason and her restraint. For a moment the world shrank to the two of them, the wind, the corral, the fading sunlight, and the undeniable pull between them. She wanted to speak, to reveal the secret she had carried for so long. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she focused on the work, forcing herself to act normally while Taco's presence continued to stir her in ways she could not control. Every shared task, every silent glance, rekindled the memory she had buried, memory that was as intoxicating as it was dangerous. That evening, as Clara stood on the porch watching the sun vanish behind the mesas, she felt a new awareness settle over her. The past she had hidden was no longer dormant. Taco's return had awakened it, reshaping her days and her nights. She realized with a mix of dread and anticipation that she could no longer pretend the memory or the man did not exist. The storm of the past was stirring again, and Clara knew that eventually it would demand acknowledgement. The desert held its breath with her. Every sound, the low whistle of the wind, the distant cry of a hawk, the soft snort of a horse, seemed charged with the promise and danger of what was to come. And in the quiet tension between them, memories rekindled. Clara understood that the carefully contained life she had built for herself was unraveling, thread by thread. The desert night settled over Clara Hayes's ranch like a velvet cloak, cooling the earth after the relentless heat of the day. Stars scattered across the sky, brilliant and unyielding while the wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant mesas. Clara moved about the porch with quiet diligence, brushing dust from the railing, listening to the subtle creaks and groans of the house. Her hands were steady, but her heart was not. For days now, Taco's presence had stirred a restlessness within her that she could no longer ignore, a mixture of longing, fear, and the memory of that night she had buried so deeply. Taco had been unusually quiet that evening. He sat near the edge of the corral, his silhouette strong and unyielding against the silver glow of the moon. Clara's eyes found him instinctively, even as she tried to focus on her chores. The distance between them felt charged, taut like a rope pulled to its limit, each glance carrying a weight neither dared to name. She could feel the history in his gaze, the unspoken memory of that stormy night returning with every measured motion, every deliberate tilt of his head. The night was still, save for the occasional shifting of a horse or the distant howl of a coyote. Taco stood, his boots crunching softly against the gravel, and approached Clara without a word. She felt the air change the moment he neared, the quiet night around them suddenly heavy with anticipation. Her pulse quickened, a mixture of fear and something far more dangerous, desire. The memory of him, of that single night that had left her heart trembling and her body alive with a passion she had never named, surged forward. He stopped mere feet away, close enough that she could see the faint lines of his face, the depth of his dark eyes, and the way the moonlight traced the planes of his strong features. For a long moment they simply stood there, silent, each aware of the tension between them. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, Taco spoke, words that struck Clara with the force of a revelation she had long denied herself. "I can't forget your taste." The words hit her like lightning. Her breath caught, and she had to steady herself against the railing. The memory she had tried to lock away, the secret she had vowed never to reveal, was no longer hers alone. He remembered it. He remembered her. The intimacy she had once feared would be lost to time had etched itself into his mind as vividly as it had into hers. For a moment, Clara's carefully constructed composure shattered, leaving her exposed to a storm of emotion she could no longer contain. Taco stepped closer, the quiet authority in his movements demanding acknowledgement. Clara's hands trembled slightly, her fingers brushing the rough wood of the railing as if grounding herself. She wanted to speak, to deny, to retreat into the safety of propriety, but the truth had a power beyond her control. His words were a key unlocking a memory she had buried in shadows, and the longing that had been simmering quietly for years now rose to the surface. You remember?" she whispered, voice barely audible over the wind. I do, he replied simply, his gaze unwavering. I've never forgotten. Not a moment. Not a touch. Not you. The desert around them seemed to fade into insignificance, leaving only the two of them suspended in the silver light of the moon. The fear of judgment, of danger, even of propriety, fell away, leaving the raw truth of their connection. Clara's pulse raced, her mind a whirl of recollection and desire, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to acknowledge the depth of her feelings. That night, under the vast expanse of stars, the air between Clara and Taco shifted irrevocably. Words could no longer contain what memory, longing, and unspoken desire had already declared. The secret she had carried alone for so long had been awakened, not just remembered but shared. And in that whisper, in that acknowledgement, a door had opened that could never be closed. The desert held its breath with them, the night itself a witness to the undeniable truth. A memory long hidden, a passion long suppressed had returned, and nothing could turn it away. The days that followed Taco's whispered confession were some of the most disorienting Clara Hayes had ever experienced. The vast New Mexico desert, usually a place of solace, now seemed to press in around her, charged with a tension she could neither name nor escape. Every glance Taco cast her way, every brush of his hand against hers while working, felt like a spark ready to ignite. And yet, she reminded herself, desire alone could not govern her life. Clara moved about the ranch with deliberate focus, but her thoughts continually wandered back to that night, the storm, his touch, the memory of him that she had never shared with another soul. She felt torn between caution and longing. Taco was a warrior, a man of his people, and his presence was as disruptive as it was magnetic. She feared the judgment of the townsfolk, the whispers that could follow any hint of impropriety. And yet she could not deny the pull of her own heart. Taco, too, was a study in quiet restraint. He stayed close to her but never overstepped the invisible boundary she had set. Yet in the small moments, helping with a stubborn horse, passing tools along the corral, or standing close enough that their fingers brushed, he reminded her that the night they shared was more than memory. Every subtle gesture, every lingering look, was a challenge to her defenses, an unspoken invitation that Clara felt compelled to resist even as her body and heart betrayed her. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mesas and painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Clara found herself alone with Taco near the corral. The air was still, heavy with the scent of sage and dry earth, and even the horses seemed to pause as if sensing the tension. She forced herself to focus on repairing a broken fence, her hands working with mechanical precision, her breath coming a little too quickly. You think too much, Taco said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. He leaned against the rail beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. About what? About me? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though it betrayed the fluttering of her heart. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached out and adjusted a post she had set crooked, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was electric, simple and almost innocent, yet it sent a shiver through her, rekindling memories she had tried so hard to forget. About everything, he said finally, eyes locking with hers. And nothing. All at once, Clara swallowed hard. Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Part of her wanted to flee, to protect herself from the vulnerability she felt, from the risk of passion and pain intertwined. Yet another part, stronger and more insistent than ever, longed to step closer, to give in to the undeniable connection that had survived years of silence and distance, the memory of that night, of his hands, his voice. The intimacy she had never spoken of loomed large, a tidal wave against her fragile composure. For the first time since his return, she allowed herself to voice the doubt that had haunted her. Taco, what are we doing? This is dangerous. You cannot ignore it, he said softly, cutting her off with certainty. And I would not let you even if you tried. This is who we are, and it cannot be undone. Her heart raced as the truth settled over her like the desert twilight. He was right. The connection, the memory, the desire, they were real, undeniable, and no amount of fear could erase them. Clara's chest tightened with both longing and hesitation, the pull of the past and the present colliding in a way that left her dizzy and breathless. As the night deepened and the stars emerged overhead, Clara realized she was standing at the edge of a precipice, One step forward could mean surrendering to desire, to a man she had never forgotten, to a passion she had buried for too long. One step back would preserve safety but leave her yearning. And in the desert, under the quiet scrutiny of the mesas and the wind, Clara Hayes understood that her heart, conflicted and raw, would not be denied forever. The tranquility of Clara Hayes's ranch had been fragile at best, and the return of Taco had made it a living tension, a tightrope strung across the wide desert. Yet Clara had managed to maintain some semblance of control, keeping the memory of that stormy night buried while navigating the dangerous and intimate dynamics between herself and Taco. That fragile balance shattered one sweltering afternoon, when the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the horizon, carrying with them the unmistakable threat of intrusion. It was Randall Keaton, a rival rancher from the neighboring territory, riding with his usual smirk and self-assured swagger. His reputation for scheming and manipulation preceded him. Clara had heard whispers in the town about Keaton, a man who thrived on scandal, someone who would not hesitate to exploit secrets for profit or vengeance. The moment she saw him approaching, her stomach knotted. Keaton had always been the sort to sniff out weakness, and she feared he might discover the truth she had fought so hard to keep hidden. Taco noticed immediately, his dark eyes narrowing as he rode to meet the intruder. His presence was commanding, radiating an authority that Clara had come to rely on, but the tension in the air between the two men was palpable. Clara felt her pulse accelerate, not from fear of violence, but from the realization that her carefully guarded secret might no longer remain hers. Keaton dismounted with a flourish, his gaze flicking to Clara with a mix of curiosity and cunning. "Good afternoon, Miss Hayes," Keaton said smoothly, though the edge in his tone betrayed him. "I was just passing through and thought I'd see how my neighbor is faring." Clara forced a polite smile, though her hands trembled slightly. "We're managing quite well," she replied cautiously. Her eyes met Taco's briefly, and she saw the silent warning in them. He would protect her, but he could not erase what might be revealed. Keaton's gaze lingered, sharp and calculating. "I hear strange tales, of course," he said, voice low, "about visitors to your property, strange companions. People don't usually come calling out here without cause." His words were deliberate, aimed at prying into a world Clara had worked tirelessly to keep hidden. Clara's heart raced. Her mind reeled with the potential consequences. If Keaton discovered Taco's presence and, more importantly, the intimate history they shared, the scandal could ruin her reputation, even in a town that already viewed a widow with suspicion. She realized with a pang of fear that some secrets once revealed could never be contained again. Taco, sensing her distress, stepped closer, placing a protective hand near her waist. The subtle but unmistakable claim of his presence communicated more than words could. "Miss Hayes's life is her own," he said calmly but firmly. "I assure you, you will find no scandal here." Keaton's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, his eyes flashing with malice. "Careful, friend," he warned, voice low. "Everyone has a price, and some secrets. Well, they're worth more than a little trouble." With that, he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and a lingering sense of menace behind him. Clara exhaled, the tightness in her chest slowly easing, but her mind was anything but calm. Taco's protective presence reassured her, yet she knew the danger was far from over. The encounter had exposed the fragility of her carefully constructed life and the reality that her secret, her past with Taco, was a liability in the eyes of those who would exploit it. That night, as Clara and Taco tended to the horses under the pale moonlight, she finally spoke the words she had kept silent for so long. "Taco, if anyone ever finds out about that night, about us, I don't know if I can survive it." Taco's expression softened, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Then we guard it together," he said quietly. "I've never forgotten you, Clara, and I will not let anyone hurt you or us because of what we share." For the first time, Clara realized that some secrets could no longer be hidden, but they could be defended. The bond between them, born of a memory long buried, was no longer something she had to face alone. And though danger lingered on the horizon, she found solace in the knowledge that Taco, the man who had returned like a storm in her life, would stand by her side no matter the cost. The sun had dipped below the mesas, leaving a dusky violet haze over Clara Hayes's ranch. The air was heavy, charged with tension, and even the horses seemed restless, stamping their hooves and snorting into the evening wind. For days, the outlaws Randall Keaton had whispered about had been spotted near the canyon's edge, and tonight, Clara knew they would strike. Taco's dark figure moved with quiet precision across the corral, checking the barricades and signaling the ranch hands who had been too inexperienced to understand the threat fully. Clara's heart pounded in rhythm with the wind against the buildings. She had survived storms, isolation, and grief, yet she felt a primal fear tonight that left her both anxious and alive. She had tried to be practical, to focus on keeping the ranch safe, but Taco's presence magnified every sensation. His hands, brushing against hers as he handed her tools or steadied a horse, sent tremors through her body she had tried to bury. And now, with real danger approaching, the intimacy between them grew impossible to ignore. The outlaws came under the cover of darkness, their shadows stretching across the desert like creeping predators. The first shots rang out, and the sharp smell of gunpowder mingled with the dry, sage-scented air. Clara's instincts took over. She ducked behind a haystack, heart hammering while Taco moved like a shadow, intercepting a group of attackers with swift, controlled movements. Clara's breath caught every time she saw him move. Every flick of his wrist, every calculated strike. Every protective gesture toward her reminded her of that stormy night she had never spoken of. Then, a sudden crash, a splintered fence, a rider bearing down on the barn. Clara froze, and for the first time fear gripped her utterly. Taco was beside her in an instant, steadying her with hands that were as strong as they were familiar. Their bodies pressed together briefly, and the heat of that contact, combined with the adrenaline, forced Clara's buried emotions to the surface. "You have to trust me," he said, his voice low, almost a growl, and she did, not just because of the danger, but because she had never truly stopped trusting him. She felt the memory of that night, the intimacy, the closeness, surged through her with a force that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and she realized she no longer cared about propriety, or caution, or the world's judgment. Together, they moved as one, Taco leading, Clara following, the bond forged in memory and heightened by fear guiding their actions. Every glance, every touch, every whispered command carried an intimacy she could no longer deny. And then, in the heat of the fight, when one of the outlaws lunged toward her, Taco shielded her with his body, and Clara, caught in the mix of fear, relief, and desire, found herself clinging to him in a way that went beyond mere survival. It was a moment of surrender, not just to the danger around them, but to the emotions she had kept locked away for so long. The adrenaline, the closeness, the recognition of the man who had haunted her memory, forced her to confront the truth. She wanted him, needed him, and feared nothing more than a life without him. Taco's voice, rough with urgency yet soft in its intent, whispered in her ear, "You are mine, Clara, and I will not let anything take you from me." In that charged moment, the line between danger and desire blurred. The desert around them faded, leaving only the shared heat of their connection, the brush of his hand against hers, the weight of his body shielding hers. Clara's fear became a conduit for passion, a raw acknowledgement of what had never truly left her. By the time the outlaws were driven off, scattered into the shadows of the canyon, Clara stood trembling, leaning against Taco, her chest heaving. The fight had not only tested their bodies, but had stripped away every pretense, every wall, leaving the truth exposed. They had survived together, and in doing so they had crossed a threshold. The secret she had carried alone, the night she had never revealed, had transformed into a shared reality, one of passion, trust, and undeniable love. The morning after the attack, the desert felt different to Clara Hayes. The sun rose over the mesas with a gentle, forgiving light, spilling gold across the ranch that had been battered but still standing. The night's chaos had left its marks, broken fences, trampled hay, and bruises on both men and horses. But for Clara, the physical damage was minor compared to the emotional reckoning she now faced. She had survived storms, isolation, and fear, yet nothing had forced her to confront her heart so directly as the events of the previous evening. Taco moved among the ranch hands, his presence calm and commanding, repairing the damage with a meticulous efficiency that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the night before. Clara watched him from the porch, her pulse still quickening at the sight. But unlike before, there was no longer a churning fear beneath her admiration. The night's events had stripped away pretense and hesitation. She had surrendered to the reality of her feelings and, in doing so, had discovered a profound sense of clarity. When he finally approached her, the usual tension that had accompanied their interactions was replaced with a quiet understanding. His dark eyes softened as they met hers, a subtle acknowledgement of the night they had endured together. There was no need for whispered confessions or lingering glances. The shared experience of survival and intimacy had communicated everything necessary. Clara felt a weight lift from her chest. The long-buried memories she had once feared exposing now transformed into a foundation upon which trust and love could grow. "Are you hurt?" Taco asked, his voice low, gentle, carrying a warmth that belied the warrior's strength she had come to respect so fiercely. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice trembled slightly, betraying the depth of emotion that had been awakened. "But last night everything changed, didn't it?" He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, it did. And I would not undo it for anything." His hand brushed hers briefly, a gesture that carried reassurance, intimacy, and the silent promise of protection. Clara felt the ache she had carried for years, of longing, secrecy, and restrained desire, begin to ease. She realized that the night she had feared revealing, the memory she had guarded so fiercely, was no longer a burden but a shared truth. In the days that followed, they worked together to repair the ranch. Yet the work was no longer merely practical. It became a means of weaving their lives closer together, a ritual of acceptance. Taco's presence was no longer disruptive but grounding. The memory of the night she had kept secret became a touchstone, a reminder that they had survived not just the dangers of the desert, but the storm within their own hearts. Clara found herself laughing, sharing stories of the land, and feeling a warmth in her chest she had thought lost forever. It was in these quiet moments, when the wind whispered through the sagebrush and the horses grazed peacefully, that Clara understood the depth of her healing. She had been alone for too long, haunted by fear and memory. Yet Taco's return had not only rekindled desire, it had allowed her to embrace her past without shame, to accept the part of herself that had loved and remembered, and to see that love could be reciprocated. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she admitted one evening as they stood together on the porch, watching the sun set over the mesas. "Not like this. Not with anyone." Taco's hand found hers, holding it with quiet certainty. "Then let this be our beginning," he said. "Not the end of what we were, but the start of what we can be together." The wind carried their words across the desert, mingling with the distant calls of hawks and the soft rustle of grass. Clara felt a sense of completeness she had not known was possible. The fear, the longing, and the secret she had carried alone for so long were finally met with understanding, acceptance, and love. In the wide expanse of the New Mexico desert, she had found not only a protector in Taco but a partner, a companion, and a mirror for her own heart. As the stars emerged above the mesas that night, Clara Hayes realized that the past she had feared, the night she had never revealed, had led her here, to a place of healing, trust, and shared desire. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. The morning sun rose over Clara Hayes's ranch with a brilliance that seemed almost miraculous after the turbulence of recent days. Golden rays spilled across the mesas, and the wind carried the scent of sage and fresh earth, filling the air with a quiet promise. Clara stood on the porch, her hands resting lightly on the railing, her eyes tracing the contours of the land she had fought so hard to protect. For the first time in years, she felt a deep sense of peace, not just in the desert surrounding her, but within herself. Taco emerged from the corral, his silhouette dark against the brightening sky, moving with the familiar grace that had first drawn her gaze 3 years ago. But now their connection was no longer built on memory alone. Their shared trials, the battles faced together, the whispered confessions, and the long-hidden desires had forged a bond that was unshakable. He approached with a confidence softened by tenderness, a man who had once been a storm in her life and now stood as its calm center. "You're watching the sunrise again," Taco said, his voice low, carrying that quiet warmth she had come to rely on. "I suppose I am," Clara replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. "There's something different about it today." He stepped closer, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, his hand lingering a moment longer than necessary. "Different," he repeated, his dark eyes searching hers. "Because you've learned to embrace it, not fear it. The past is behind us. What we have, What we choose to build is ours. Clara felt the weight of those words settle into her chest like a soothing balm. The stormy night she had never revealed, the secret that had haunted her for years, had become the cornerstone of their trust and love. It was no longer a memory to be hidden or a shame to be carried alone. It was the genesis of something enduring. In Taco's eyes, she saw the reflection of herself, a woman who had survived, who had fought for her life and her heart, and who now could step forward unafraid. Together, they walked through the ranch, inspecting the repairs and tending to the horses. The work was no longer a chore or a duty. It was a shared ritual, a way of weaving their lives together. Each glance, each brush of hands, each quiet conversation reinforced their bond. The desert that had once been lonely and imposing now felt like a sanctuary, a place where love, respect, and desire coexisted freely. Clara paused at the edge of the corral, watching the sun climb higher. "I never imagined this," she said softly. "I thought I would live and die with the memory of that night without ever knowing without ever knowing you again." Taco's hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a certainty that was comforting and exhilarating all at once. "Fate has its ways," he said, voice gentle yet resolute. "That night brought us together. It haunted us, yes, but it also led us here. And now we choose the life we will live from this day forward." The wind carried their words across the rolling plains, mingling with the calls of hawks and the whispering grass. Clara's heart swelled with the recognition of everything they had endured, the storms, the secrets, the fear, and how those trials had forged a love that was unshakable, vibrant, and real. She understood now that the past, no matter how painful or secretive, had guided them toward a shared future, one they would build together with intention and courage. As the sun fully rose, casting the desert in a brilliant glow, Clara and Taco stood side by side, looking out over the land they had reclaimed, defended, and nurtured. Their fingers brushed, their shoulders touched, and in that quiet communion a promise was made, not just to each other, but to the life they would face together. For Clara Hayes, the widow who had carried a secret for years, the dawn of this day marked the beginning of something entirely new. The past was no longer a burden. It was a bridge to a future filled with trust, passion, and enduring love. And as they watched the sun climb over the mesas hand in hand, the desert itself seemed to celebrate with them, the wide, wild landscape bearing witness to a love that had survived storms, silence, and time, and now finally could flourish. The dawn was theirs,